Welcome to the Intuitive Eating Mama podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer D'Amato. I am an intuitive eating counselor and I'm also a mom to four. This podcast is not just for mamas, it's for all women who are ready to ditch diets, ditch the scale and food guilt forever, and instead invite peace with food, increase their body trust, and confidence in all of her choices. I believe this show is going to shed some light on sneaky ways diet culture has infiltrated your thoughts, your family, and your well-being. No matter the episode, I want you to walk away feeling informed, inspired, and encouraged. So whether you're taking a walk, washing the dishes, or carting kids around, let's dive into the latest episode on the Intuitive Eating Mama podcast. Hey ladies, I am so excited for you to hear this episode today and my interview with Dr. Diana Gordon. She's a licensed psychologist, coach, and content creator, and she specializes in intuitive eating and health at every size. I enjoyed this conversation so much. I don't know if it was that feeling of being back in college. My degree is in psychology. I've always been fascinated with the brain, and we talk about so much. It's so good and it's accessible to you. I really believe there's some great things in here that you can try on and see how they fit into your life. Dr. Gordon draws on both her personal and professional experience to dismantle fat phobia and to help people live free from dieting. It's important to note that even though I have a doctor here on the podcast, all content shared on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered to be a diagnosis or treatment plan. I can't wait any longer to dive into this amazing interview. Thank you, Dr. Gordon, for coming on the podcast. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Yes. Are you okay if I call you Diana?
Yes, I prefer that. Thank you.
Wonderful. I love it. It's like, when you get to know someone, when I first met you, I am just that person. I'm like, Dr. Gordon. And then I feel like we've really established such a good relationship. And I know that the ladies listening are going to feel that connection with you as well. So I appreciate that, Diana. Would you mind taking some time and just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do in this world?
Yes. So I am a licensed psychologist in California, and I offer both psychotherapy and coaching with a focus on intuitive eating from a health at every size, fat liberation, and body liberation perspective. And so I am a person living in a larger body who's immersed in this work in my personal life and also have more than a decade of clinical experience working with folks around eating and body image. And recently, in the last 2 years, I've become more active on social media and have been creating more content on Instagram. I really enjoy the ability to kind of reach more than just the people that I'm able to work with one-on-one. And so I love doing things like podcasts or content creation. It gives me a chance to connect with people out there who want to learn about intuitive eating and may not have access to the services that I offer or that others offer.
Yeah. And I have to say personally, I'm so grateful that you decided to get on social media because that's how we connected and we share so much in common in that space. And I have to say, I have not had a lot of lived in experience in a larger body up until recently. And I've been doing a lot of work like on things like the word fat, on being in a larger body and really trying to have understanding and acknowledgement and respect for those who have that lived in experience. I even joined this beautiful learning group to be able to do that. So I'm curious how your lived in experience, did it lead you into the work you're doing now? Did you always do this type of work?
Yeah, I think that what's so interesting about like lived in experience and larger bodies is just that we always have, to think about our positionality, like with respect to others in this space. And so I identify as a fat person, I identify as living in a larger body. And then I also acknowledge that I have thin privilege relative to a lot of folks who are larger than I am. And I think one of the big differences between my experience and people who are larger than I am is that I have limited experience encountering systemic barriers, like, for example, needing a seatbelt extender or not fitting in a seat. However, I would definitely say that my lived experience propelled me to go into this kind of work because I have had a lot of experiences of fat phobia. Growing up, I grew up in an intensely fat phobic environment. And I internalized a lot of fat phobia, a lot of beliefs about like, oh, if I don't lose weight, I'm going to end up getting diabetes. I'm going to end up dying young. And so I had a lot of fears about what it would be like to live in a larger body. And so when I was in graduate school, I started doing eating disorder work. But one of the things that I struggled with was I was almost always the only fat clinician in the room. And so I started to feel like, you know, like I was so in, like I had internalized so much fat phobia that I thought like nobody's going to want to listen to me about advice about how to eat because they don't want to look like me. And it kind of drove me out of doing eating disorder work for a while because of my own internalized fat phobia and because it was just really difficult to be in environments where people would be making fat phobic statements and not really realizing that like there was a fat person in the room with them. And so I moved away from it for a little bit. And then during the pandemic, I got certified in intuitive eating. And I really started to learn about how much bigger fat phobia was than me. Like I really started to learn about how it's linked to racism, how it's linked to classism, how it's linked to patriarchy. And I started to realize like, this is not just about me. Like this is about a system of oppression that affects a lot of people. And I have privilege, like I have educational privilege, I have white privilege. And so I want to be a person who works to affect change in a system that has oppressed me and is continuing to oppress a lot of people. And so that's what kind of got me back into the intuitive eating space and feeling like I can take up space in this world. And like I have a valuable voice to add because there's a lot of folks who don't want to work with thin providers. I didn't want to work with a thin provider when I was in recovery, but I couldn't find anyone who looked like me who was doing this kind of work. And so that's what really inspired me to rededicate myself to eating disorder and disordered eating work.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So there's so many things I want to we could unpack here. And I'm so appreciative of everything that you just shared. And that last bit, I actually had someone, come to me in the DMs and actually, I'd never had this happen before. Thanked me, that I put my body out on Instagram. I mean, reels and I'm talking and all of this. And she felt like I came off relatable as far as the struggles I had because I did struggle with orthorexia. I, was so focused on being skinny, thin, and very unhealthy at the time. It was so unhealthy. And I look, back at that, but she said what you've gone through, but where you are and that you like are relatable to me. And she was talking about my body size. And I'm really doing a terrible job of like summarizing how she wrote this beautiful thing, but that she felt kind of what you're sharing, that same experience of providers, practitioners, coaches, therapists, that you feel represented. And that was something, again, my eyes have been completely opened as well, which is why I even was like, I need to educate myself and learn more in something I don't understand, and also be like, I don't understand. I can be, sympathetic, empathetic, have compassion. Compassion is probably my number one, thing that I offer, but I don't have the understanding. I don't have the lived in experience. So I'm choosing to learn. I'm choosing to step into that space. And I think it's so funny. During the same time, probably in 2020, I was in the professionals intuitive eating with Evelyn. And like, I wonder, like, were we in at the same time? Because I mean, there was so much to unpack then. And so much I feel like came out of that time frame, 2020, when people were at home. Not all good things, I would say, at all, but we were really addressing some heavy topics from home. So I appreciate so much of what you shared. And I'm curious because we've had these conversations about dieting, and are you okay if we go there? Because I
Oh
know
yeah,
eating
yeah,
disorders. Most of my listeners and those that I work with, definitely it's disordered eating and dieting. And
absolutely.
what
I
we've
do
talked
all
about,
three.
okay, yeah, I was like, you cover all of them because
Yeah,
and
the
that's
full
something I even
spectrum.
think is important to say, that if you have a diagnosed eating disorder or you suspect that you do, that Dr. Diana Gordon is someone, and that's where I like to refer, when I know someone has an eating disorder. That's not what I do. That's out of my
Yeah.
scope of practice. And I think that's important for people to understand, is you do need a different level. You need therapy. That's what it
Yeah.
is. You need a
Yeah, you
therapeutic
need
setting.
psychotherapy with a licensed provider.
Yes.
So I do
Yes.
not see people with eating disorders in my coaching
Right.
practice. I only see them in my psychotherapy practice. And then I will work with folks who struggle with dieting and restriction and disordered eating in the coaching sort of side of
Yeah.
my business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the topics I was really interested in kind of bringing onto the podcast was this mental health aspect that goes hand in hand with dieting, and kind of
Hmm.
what you see out there happening. Because I think we can all say, all right, I can see the physical part of it, the yo-yo chronic dieting, and that the weight loss fluctuations, and even what that does to our physical health. Like there's a lot of negative effects of yo-yo dieting and that weight loss and those fluctuations. But what about the mental health aspect? What's happening when we stay in that diet cycle? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think there are so many aspects of mental health that are damaged by dieting. And I think, on a most basic level, right? Like when we go on a diet, we are saying like, I don't like myself how I am. I want to change myself. And I think from a really fundamental place, like that feels devaluing to us as human beings. Like there's something wrong with me and I have to follow this plan. I have to follow this set of rules because I have to fix this thing that's wrong with me. And we know that when people have a belief that there's something wrong with them, that those beliefs can fuel depression, anxiety, sleep issues, eating disorders, all of those things, right? And so I think that when you come at people from this place of like, you need to fix yourself, you are really sort of, playing into these biases of like, there's something wrong with how we look. And yeah, it's certainly correlated with higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety. I also think that for people who have mental health concerns, who feel depressed or anxious or have trauma histories, dieting can be especially alluring because it can feel like a way of escaping. Like, well, I may not be able to control my depression, but I can control what I eat today by like following this diet program. And so I think it's sort of a bi-directional relationship where both that dieting can exacerbate or cause mental health issues, and also that folks with more mental health struggles tend to be more likely to get sucked into these diet programs. And so I think it actually goes both ways.
Oh my gosh. As you're saying this, I'm seeing marketing ads. I am seeing
Yeah.
like their messaging knows this, right? Like they're really play into this, that potentially their buyers, their customers are struggling with these. And again, as you are sharing, I'm thinking this could have started for someone at 8 years old or
Oh,
younger. I
yeah.
mean, but I
Yeah.
have a lot of clients where that first diet or their mother took them to Weight Watchers, they were 8, they were 10, that those beliefs about your body being like in those formative years as well. I can only imagine like if that stays that way for so long and then they meet someone like you to work with, there's a lot of unpacking that has to be done.
Yeah. So Jacqueline Persons, who's the creator of cognitive behavioral case conceptualization, so cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, she talks about like these different layers of thinking and the ways in which people develop a set of beliefs, often at a young age, that then affect the way they think about themselves. And so there's sort of three levels of cognition that we think about in cognitive therapy. So the deepest level of cognition is what we call core beliefs. And these are like the deep-seated beliefs that we form about ourselves from a young age that continue to affect the way we move through the world as we grow up. Intermediate beliefs are more like global sets of assumptions. So like an example of a core belief would be something like, I'm defective, there's something wrong with me, right? An intermediate belief that might stem from that is being fat is bad, being overweight is bad, I'm unhealthy. And then the third level of cognition, like the most conscious or basic level, is what we call automatic thoughts. And the way I explain those is just that, like, if you're walking down the street, you could be having like 20 different thoughts at once, right? Like, oh, look at that leaf changing colors. Like, I'm kind of in the mood for an apple. Oh, my stomach is hanging over my jeans. There are all of these different thoughts that come up, right? And so, how do we choose what thoughts we focus on or pay attention to? So, the theory is that the way that we sort of choose is that the deepest and most entrenched core and intermediate beliefs sort of influence the thoughts that come up, right? So, if you think about this relationship of like you have a core belief, if there's something wrong with me, you have intermediate beliefs of being fat is bad, my body is bad, I have to change it. What are going to be the automatic thoughts that run through your head all day? They're going to be about dieting. They're going to be about fixing yourself and changing yourself. And so when you look at like cognitive theory, I think it actually really perfectly explains the way that dieting programs tap into these three levels of cognition. And there's a reason they start young, right? Like there's a reason why they let kids go to Weight Watchers meetings, because then you can get those core and intermediate beliefs like really entrenched in people. And then as they grow up, they continue to hold those beliefs and they have a lot of thoughts about dissatisfaction about their body. And so they go right back to Weight Watchers, you know?
Gosh, this is like my brain's having a lot of thoughts right now. Like there's so much happening for me.
Thoughts right now. Yeah.
There's so much happening for me. And I think it's because I was literally just talking with a client yesterday, and that's why it's so in the front of my mind about television shows. We were having this conversation. Oftentimes we talk about magazines and the influence they've had. We were talking about this one particular episode of Full House. Now, remember that DJ Tanner, and she was struggling with her body image. And on the surface, this episode seemed like, we're addressing a big issue where she didn't like her body and she was really doing things that were very, very dangerous. And then in swoops helping her, and, 30 minutes, everything's wrapped up. Except I said, watch it. I watched it recently as an adult in this space. And it was Aunt Becky who came in, because she was addressing it with her having the influence over, we know she didn't have a mom and she didn't have that influence. The guys don't know how to talk to her, et cetera, sitcoms. And Becky said something that to my core, like it had an impact on me at the time. Like, if you're going to be healthy, you don't have to do all these toxic things, but I just have boiled chicken, some brown rice, and some steamed vegetables. And I was like, say what now? But we take those messages, right? Very young. I can remember I was pretty young. Maybe I was 8 or 10 watching even those shows. And I listened to some of the stuff, my kids, listen to, and how it's really intertwined. Because we were talking about The Office. I'm such a sitcom watcher. We were talking about The Office and How I Met Your Mother. And of course, all of these things are just so prevalent that they even pull out these core beliefs you have and get these thoughts that you're constantly focused on that.
Totally. Yeah. Like, because I have so many clients who will say something to me, like, they're like, yeah, I was having a really good day. Like, I was feeling really good about myself. And like, I got an ice cream cone and I was like really feeling like empowered eating it. And then like, I caught my reflection in the window of the ice cream shop and I had the thought of, I'm so disgusting. And I just spiraled from there. And it seems like it came out of nowhere. And then we sit with it and we're like, well, did it come out of nowhere? Or like, did one of those kind of core or intermediate beliefs that you developed when you were younger from all of these, media, family, friend influences, did one of those kind of get activated in that moment? And so these thoughts, these negative thoughts we have about our bodies, like they definitely don't come out of nowhere. And what happens is the more of these sort of damaging core beliefs that we form, our brains are sort of constantly building a case for them, right? So once we hold a belief, we are looking for evidence that supports that belief. And so a lot of the cognitive work that I do with folks is helping them build up evidence for alternative beliefs. So, like, let's assume for a second that, like, you're not disgusting. All right. Well, what evidence do we have that supports that? And like really working with people to try to change those thought patterns by becoming aware of the fact not only do they hold the belief, but they're building a case for that belief without intending to. That's just how our brains work. That's how we organize information. We take something we already believe is true, and then we look for evidence to support it.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. This is so good. So my degree is in psychology, and it's because I've always loved the brain. But what I never really, I didn't understand it. Of course, when I'm young, it's not something we're taught. And I didn't really get it till I was a little bit older. It was really after school of how much we can change our thoughts. Like we can do work so that we're not living in that core belief that is toxic and harmful. So can you talk to, like, I guess I don't want to get into like all the psychology or all of that or anything, but I think that it's not something we're given that information, that those thoughts you have don't have to be those thoughts that are constantly tearing you down.
Yeah, totally. So the what I always say to people is like the good news is that once you understand how these thoughts form, you then understand how to form different thoughts. So
Mhm.
when people first learn about this, I think there's often a reaction of like overwhelm of like, oh my God, I thought I was disgusting and defective since I was 6 years old. How am I supposed to fix that now at 30 or 40 or 50? And the answer is like, well, now that you know you form that belief, you can work on replacing it with a different set of beliefs. And so there's a lot of different interventions at all three levels of thought. So there are core belief focused interventions, intermediate belief interventions, and automatic thought interventions. And because the relationship is bi-directional, meaning if you modify a core belief, the automatic thoughts change. If you modify automatic thoughts, you can also change the core beliefs, these deeper levels of thinking. And so that's where like the in the moment interventions I think are really helpful for folks. And so when I work with people, core belief work is a later stage of cognitive work. We tend to start with the automatic thoughts. We work on helping people change the way they think about themselves, think about food, and think about their bodies. And so, if anyone is listening to this and thinking, like, oh my God, I have like 100 automatic thoughts a day that are
Yeah.
negative about my body, like, and like, I'm here to say, like, I know because I used to be like
Mhm.
that. And it is a thing that you can change. And the great thing is that we don't just have to change it through cognitive strategies. Working on our behavior also changes the way we think. And so, for example, if we have a thought of, I can't eat French fries because I'll get fat. People have this belief, like they avoid all French fries or all fried food. If you decide every day for a week to have French fries for lunch and just kind of observe what that's like and allow yourself to do it, you're going to change that thought because your behavior is going to show you that that thought's not really true. Nothing catastrophic happens when you eat the French fries. And so, all of the stuff we talk about in intuitive eating, like all of these changes that we make around how we approach food, how we think about food, and even how we care for our emotions, that is all going to impact these deeper core and intermediate beliefs.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm just going to give a little warning. If any listeners have little kids around, this part I'm going to say is not for their ears. All right. Hopefully that booted everybody out. You paused it, you came back. I always use the example of Santa Claus because if you grew up at all believing something like Santa Claus, maybe there's something else for you. Maybe it's the tooth fairy or the Easter bunny, or I don't know, whatever it was. You believed this for years and you had proof. You had constant proof and validation that that existed. And then you learned a new thought. Like you had to have a whole other way. And then there was proof and repeated pattern that that was a different thought. And it's a very simplified way, and it has nothing really directly to do with our body or food, but just to show you, like, your
Mhm.
brain is so capable of this. Like, I just want to encourage
Absolutely.
women that I work with, like, it's capable. And I know I hear like my own example, and especially, when I put things out on social media, and I am the living proof of this, but dang, did that take time, work, and intentionality. Like, it wasn't something I was really just like flippant about, like, I'll, like deal with this every so often. It really was something I put into practice daily because
Yeah.
of, you're changing things, some of the things, like, again, if you're doing that deeper work and you're getting down to that core. For one example that comes up for me literally is just the 3-letter word fat. Like, I
Mm,
had so much packed into that one word that was in my core. That work didn't come easily, unpacking that and changing all the thoughts I had around that. And that's what I feel like that's what I hear you saying too, is when you're getting into those core ones, we're not even expecting that to happen. And I'm not even like overnight. That sounds so simple, but that's a process. That's something that's going to take
absolutely.
time.
Yeah, my work is also really heavily influenced by mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy, which is what we call a third wave cognitive behavioral therapy. And Steve Hayes, the creator of ACT, has this amazing phrase. He always says, like, don't believe everything you think. And I love that. Like, I
I
think
do
it's
too.
such
Oh my gosh, that's so good.
it's so good. Like, because I tell myself that, like, I'll be having anxious thoughts and I'll think to myself, like, these might not all be true.
Oh my
Like,
gosh, that's so
let's
good.
start there. Like, this might not all be true. The other thing that I really love about ACT is, like, in cognitive behavioral therapy in the traditional school, the focus is on changing our negative thoughts. And I think changing our negative thoughts is a great goal and is often very effective. But something that I often bring in from, like, the acceptance and commitment world is that in the acceptance and commitment world, there's a lot of, like, moving alongside your thoughts and kind of bringing them with you, right? So, like, there's a metaphor and act of, like, let's say that you're feeling like you're about to go to a friend's party and there's going to be a lot of food there and you're feeling nervous because you're not sure if you're going to overeat or if you might binge or if the food is going to be on your diet plan if you're dieting. And so you might then be like, you know what, I can't go to this party. Like, this, I don't want to risk it. This is too stressful for me. I don't want to risk it. In ACT, we might say, can you pack up those thoughts, put them in your purse or your backpack and bring it with you to the party? Like, instead of trying to chase the thoughts away, there's this idea of, like, we can bring those thoughts and fears with us and we can still choose with our behavior to do what we know we want to do. And so, or even like the example of, like, you think you shouldn't eat dessert, you're having thoughts, I shouldn't eat dessert, but you want dessert. So could you eat the dessert while also understanding that there are some thoughts present telling you not to eat it?
Mhm.
And so it's almost like it sets up this, rather than having like this fight of, like, no, like, this is right, no, this is right. Kind of says you have to say, here's a thought. I think it's true, but it's present. I'm going to tolerate it and bring it with me while I do what I want to do.
Oh, that's so good. And it really complements how we're really living in this place where there isn't that binary thinking, right? That black and white thinking, that, hard line anymore. And that is
Yeah.
something that I always tell people I'm going to rewrite curriculums because here's what we really need to learn. Here's what we really need to understand when we're younger, that two things can coexist like at the
Yeah.
same time. And that's what you're
Yeah.
saying, is both
Yeah.
of these things can exist. And if you knew that,
Totally.
like, what if
Yeah.
you knew that all along?
Yeah.
Even if, you
Yeah.
you have these thoughts, because of the media, because of the world, because you watched your mother diet after diet, but you knew you could live in a world where things could coexist. I
Yeah.
wonder how much more even empowering that would be. Like, okay, so I can have a thought, I can feel this way, but I can still do the thing that I'd really like to do.
Yeah. That's called cognitive diffusion, which is just a fancy way of saying it's like defusing, stepping back from our thoughts and recognizing thoughts are thoughts and I am me. So, like, the thoughts are not me. they are just thoughts.
Oh my
And
gosh, I
so
love this.
being in, you know, like there's one technique and act that I love that's like, thank your mind for that thought. Like, thanks for that thought, mind. Like, I'm going to keep eating this cake, right? Like, thanks for that thought, mind.
I
Like,
have done that. I
yeah,
think because so often we do think the only thing we're supposed to do is attack the thought, right? And then
right.
that can even land us in a really negative space because we're in this constant battle with ourself.
Yeah.
And what if it's kind of like I always say, I guess maybe I haven't thanked it, but acknowledge it. Like I see you,
Mm-hmm.
like I see you
Mm-hmm.
here. Like
Uh-huh.
we're not hanging out. And maybe I'm going to try on the gratitude part of that. Thanks. Like it might be really
Thanks for
sassy.
that. Yeah. No, and it can be, right? Like it can be like, okay, thanks for that. I'm still gonna do what I want, right? Um, you know, like another diffusion technique that a lot of people like is like to imagine, like, have you ever heard of the leaves on the stream analogy? This might be helpful to people listening. But basically, if you imagine yourself kind of sitting next to a stream and there's lots of rocks in the stream and the water is flowing, it goes over the rocks and you see a lot of leaves in the stream and the leaves are kind of flowing and the leaves move at different rates, right? Like some of them get stuck on a rock, some of them keep going. And what you notice is that no matter how hard you think about it, you're not changing the pattern of how the leaves flow, right? Like they're just flowing, right? And so you imagine yourself sitting there next to that stream. Like, can you plop that thought you're having onto a leaf? Like, I'm too fat to go to this party. Like, I don't deserve to have dessert tonight. You kind of imagine like plopping it onto a leaf. And what you notice is like you don't control how quickly that leaf goes away, right? Maybe it's going to hang out for a while. Maybe it's going to keep flowing, but it's just this way of relating to our thoughts where we kind of realize like I can play with this a little bit because again, I'm not my thoughts. They are just thoughts.
Oh
And we
my
don't always have to
goodness.
fight.
This is so good. I've always used like a boat in a river, or a canoe or something like that. But the leaves, what I love is that you even give acknowledgement. Sometimes those thoughts stick around for a while. Sometimes they linger longer than we'd like, but eventually something happens and they flow along and they
Yeah.
move along. And even knowing that, I talk about emotions, you know, and how, yes, as high as emotions can get, they don't always stay there. Eventually, there's going to be a lessening. And even with our thoughts, this same idea that it might feel really strong, really like powerful in your head, loud, like the speakers all the way up. You know, always picture those old speakers where you just crank that sucker, right? It's like
Yeah.
blasting, but that eventually it's going to move. And even
Yeah.
knowing that, I wonder how much more peaceful we could be like, okay, I'm having the thought. It's really strong, really bad, but it's not going to be this way. It is eventually going to lessen, move. And then sometimes that's when we can
Exactly.
even do some work, right? When I think
Yeah.
it's hard when it's so strong, like it's on high volume to do
Oh, yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And even having strategies in place for helping the leaf maybe move a little bit so we can start doing some work. But this imagery is everything to me. The
Yeah.
leaves, like that, again, it just up levels the canoe because the canoes just seem to keep moving, but no, sometimes they stop.
Sometimes
That
they
leaf,
stop. Well, and something I think I really want to emphasize for people listening is that these are pretty sophisticated techniques that sound easy, but are actually hard to do. And I say that because I think people can get very discouraged. Like cognitive behavioral therapy is like one of those things that like sounds straightforward, but is actually really hard. And so I always say it's simple, but it's not easy. So you might understand what we're saying here. You might say, oh, yeah, like I'm seeing how my core beliefs affect me, or I'm seeing how I can bring that backpack of negative thoughts with me, or I'm seeing how I can put my thoughts on a leaf. And then you might try it and it's like, whoa, this is really hard. And I think what I want to say to people is I consider myself like to be, you know, an expert in cognitive behavioral therapy. This is what I've been practicing for a long time. I use it in my personal life. I use it with clients. And I'll tell you, like I have moments where I'm trying to put my thoughts on the leaves and it's so chaotic that like suddenly the stream is flooding and I'm just and I'm underwater, you know? So I think to really sort of like sit with and be honest with people of like, this is a really long process because you've been
yes.
thinking the same way for a long time. And so consistency is really important. And the more that you use these techniques, the more natural it becomes. And like, and there's also other strategies I think like that you can add in that are helpful. But if you're struggling to incorporate these things, like working with someone who has expertise in these strategies can really help. And if you're not working with someone like that, practice, 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 practice is what really helps. And so don't get discouraged if you try leaves on a stream and like it's really difficult for you. Try it again.
Yeah.
And another tip that can really help is like to try doing this with thoughts that aren't that distressing first.
Yes.
So like maybe go practice leaves on a stream with just like your regular thoughts, like whatever's coming up for you right now, and get used to using the technique, because the higher, like the more emotion that a thought evokes, the more difficult these strategies can be to use. But eventually with practice, you can use them even with very intense thoughts.
Yeah. And I really appreciate your acknowledgement of time, that it is something that does. And I'd say, and I don't know your experience, but most of the women I talk to, the average time in diet culture, in actively dieting, pursuing weight loss, always focused on that, hating their body, 25 years. That's
Yeah.
the average. I mean, there's definitely a
Yeah.
lot higher. But I would say most women, and it started very young. It
Yeah.
was all consuming all the time. They've barely had breaks in the years that they've been doing it. And I don't think necessarily it's like we come in saying, I think it's going to change quickly. Man, we just want it to, because it sucks on this side. It hurts. It's when we also hear from maybe people like myself, from you, from others in the intuitive eating and HAES space, like, I want that. Like, I
Yeah.
want to feel more at peace. I want to know that even when I feel like the flood has come, I'm okay knowing how to get out of it. Like, they just want that. They want to feel more at peace. If
Yeah.
you had one starting point, one thing that the listeners could walk away with today, because you've given so much already. Like, there's a lot. And if they were like, okay, where do I start? Like, what's the best thing to do in a general sense? Because I think you're like I am, and I love personalized work. But if you
Yeah.
could give that one top thing, what would it be?
So in a general sense, I think that the core of all of this, so I think the core of emotion regulation, the core of intuitive eating, the core of just functioning in life is like learning to become more mindful, more attuned, more in touch with our bodies and with what's going on for us. And I think that the more that we can cultivate mindfulness, the more that we can use these strategies. Because in mindfulness, they say like there's power in the pause. In mindfulness, essentially, it gives you the ability to pause. It gives you the ability to be like, well, I'm having a lot of negative thoughts right now. What should I do about it? Oh, let me try one of these strategies, right? But if you don't have that pause and you're just going, like you're just so anxious, you can't even figure out what to do, you're not going to be able to use the strategies. And so I encourage everyone who's listening, who maybe, whether you've tried meditation or you haven't tried meditation, to give it a go. And I always say, like, the good news is there's a lot of data that shows that even a couple of 5-minute meditations in a week can have a huge impact on our mental health. And so you really don't need to do a lot. And if you've tried meditation and it hasn't been for you, I would encourage you to look at, like, there's so many different ways of cultivating mindfulness. Like, there's what we call mindfulness in everyday life, where you can sit and drink a cup of tea mindfully or watch the rain mindfully. You can listen to meditation music for 5 minutes. You can take a mindful 5-minute walk. You can do a guided meditation. Like, there's so many apps now, both free and paid, that have guided meditations. So if you've tried it and you've been like, this isn't for me, I've tried it and said it wasn't for me about 10 times. And then I think on the 11th time I got into it. And I'm always transparent about that like I have a meditation practice, but it wasn't easy for me. There were a lot of stops, a lot of starts, but I really think it's a transformational practice, because I think that what I tell people often is that it's not actually about the meditation, in that, like, if you feel crappy and you do a 5-minute meditation, you're probably not going to feel like $1 million afterwards. Like, it doesn't usually work like that. It's really more like, when we think about it, like with weight training, it's building the muscle. It's building that muscle of being able to take some deep breaths, take a pause, calm down, get present, get grounded. And so every time you meditate, if you think about it more like, I'm doing bicep curls than like I'm doing something to actually help me in the moment, I think that mindset can help you stick with it. And there's definitely times when you do it and it is incredibly soothing. But I think that's the biggest thing that discourages people is when they do it and they don't immediately feel better. So I try to emphasize, like, again, we keep talking about it, right? But like, it's time. It's a process.
Yeah. That's so good. Excellent, excellent advice. I love this. And I'm adding this one to my curriculum change. I'm telling you, I am an educator at heart and in practice, I was a teacher. So I'm like, I just keep making the list of all the things that I think need to be part of an educational curriculum. That imagine if we understood these kind of things from that young age, what we'd have in our tool belt throughout the tough times, throughout the messaging and all of that. So that is so beautiful. Now, listen, I love following you on Instagram. I've told you that it's one of my favorite things to do. So where can the listeners find you?
Yeah. So the best place to find me is Instagram at Dr. Diana Gordon. And that's where I announce any upcoming group coaching or classes or other opportunities to work with me. Right now, I am mostly just doing one-on-one work. So I either accept people for psychotherapy or for coaching, again, depending on the symptoms and what they need. So Instagram's a great way to find me, learn about my offerings, and also just a great place if you're hearing these techniques and you're thinking, oh, that could be kind of helpful to me. Like, I expand on a lot of these things on Instagram. I do a lot of writing so people can hopefully really learn the techniques. And I love hearing from people about things that were helpful. I also love hearing about things that weren't helpful, like, hey, this post didn't make any sense, so that I can know next time how to explain things better. So yeah, I would love for people to follow me there, engage with me there. And if there's anything that you want to hear more of or see more of, I love hearing those suggestions too. Like, oh, hey, I always had this thought. Like, what are some strategies for dealing with it? Like, I love hearing that from people.
Awesome. And I want to make sure that every link to be able to connect with Dr. Diana Gordon is going to be in the show notes. I am so grateful you had some time that we could sit down and talk. I could probably sit here longer, but I know the listeners will be like, oh my gosh, this is a 3-hour episode. What are you doing? Because I love the brain stuff and I love talking therapeutically too about this healing process. And I just enjoy my time with you. So thank you again for taking time out of your schedule to come on the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was so wonderful. And I actually got some ideas today about things I want to expand on in my content. So if you liked what you heard, you'll probably see me posting a more expanded version of this the next few weeks. So stay tuned
awesome.
for that.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, hey, look, I love it. See, things can come from both sides and we can all benefit from these discussions. I love it. And I'm hoping that the listeners also are feeling inspired to try something on and then reach out. We love the DMs. I mean, that's what we're here for. And seeing you heal, seeing you working through this is something that I think we both can agree just brings us joy in our heart. For this work. So, all right, until next week, ladies, we'll be right back here with another episode.